A white woman kicks a black girl off a basketball court, but the situation changes dramatically when her father, a state senator, shows up. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It was a sweltering summer afternoon and the neighborhood buzzed with the familiar rhythms of life. The local basketball court, tucked between two rows of trees whose sparse shade barely combated the relentless sun, was alive with activity. The sharp echo of bouncing basketballs and the shouts of teenagers filled the air. On a nearby bench, a few parents sipped coffee, their murmured conversations blending into the background of joyful chaos from the adjacent playground. Children's laughter and the faint squeak of swings provided an odd serenity to the lively scene. Amara Bennett, a 14-year-old girl with tightly cropped hair and a determined gaze, stepped onto the court with a basketball tucked under her arm. Her sneakers, though slightly scuffed, carried the marks of dedication rather than neglect. She wore a simple, athletic outfit, black shorts and a blue tank top, functional and unassuming. Yet, there was something about her presence that commanded quiet confidence. She had spent weeks perfecting her free throws and layups, and today she was eager to put her skills to the test. Amara had always found solace on the court. It was her haven, a place where the complexities of the world faded away and were replaced by the clarity of the game. But today was different. There was a quiet nervousness lingering beneath her resolve, an unfamiliar tension she couldn't shake. This was her first summer in the new neighborhood, and despite her efforts to fit in, she still felt like an outsider. As she dribbled the ball, letting its rhythmic thuds echo against the concrete, she stole a glance at a group of teens playing a pickup game. Their fluid movements and easy camaraderie reminded her of the friends she'd left behind when she moved here with her father. The thought brought a fleeting pang of loneliness, but Amara shook it off. This was her new beginning, and she intended to make the most of it. She positioned herself near the free throw line and took a deep breath. With practiced precision, she launched the ball. It sailed through the air in a perfect arc before swishing cleanly through the net. A small smile crept onto her face. Her focus sharpened, and she moved to retrieve the ball, ready for another shot. Unbeknownst to her, someone had been watching. Marilyn Brown, a middle-aged white woman with a reputation for being the self-appointed guardian of the community, stood at the edge of the court. Her arms were crossed, her lips pursed into a thin line. She was returning from the grocery store, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder, when she spotted Amara. Something about the sight of the young girl practicing alone on her neighborhood court irked her. Marilyn prided herself on keeping an eye on things, and to her, Amara was an anomaly. Her gaze lingered for a moment too long before she decided to intervene. She marched onto the court, her sandals slapping against the pavement. The sudden intrusion startled Amara, who turned just as Marilyn stopped a few feet away. "Excuse me," Marilyn said, her voice sharp and intrusive. "What are you doing here?" Amara blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Practicing?" she replied cautiously, her voice polite but confused. "This court," Marilyn began, gesturing broadly, "is for residents of this neighborhood. Are you even from around here?" Amara hesitated, sensing the undercurrent of accusation in the woman's tone. "I live nearby," she said simply, "just a couple of streets over." Marilyn's eyes narrowed. "I've lived here for 15 years, and I don't recall ever seeing you before. Do you have proof? A membership card? Anything that shows you're supposed to be here?" Amara's grip tightened on the basketball. Her initial confusion gave way to a flicker of indignation. "I don't need a card," she said, trying to keep her tone steady. "This is a public court. Marilyn let out a dry laugh, the sound dripping with condescension. Public, sure, but that doesn't mean just anyone can waltz in and start using it. We have rules here. The exchange began to draw the attention of others. A few teenagers paused their game, glancing towards the escalating conversation. Parents on the benches exchanged uncertain looks. The air around the court seemed to shift, tension creeping in like an unwelcome guest. Amara took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had faced prejudice before, but something about this encounter felt different, more deliberate, more pointed. She looked around, hoping someone might step in, but the onlookers remained silent, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "I'm not causing any trouble," Amara said, her voice firm despite the lump forming in her throat. "I just want to play." But Marilyn wasn't satisfied. She took a step closer, her tone growing harsher. "If you can't prove you belong here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Amara stood her ground, her eyes locking with Marilyn's. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. The declaration hung in the air, challenging and resolute, but Marilyn's response was swift and cutting. "Then I'll call the police. Maybe they'll sort this out." The words hit Amara like a punch to the gut. Her stomach twisted as a wave of humiliation and anger washed over her. She glanced towards the spectators silently pleading for someone, anyone, to say something. But the crowd remained frozen, their collective silence speaking volumes. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't afford to let this escalate further, but she also couldn't just walk away. With shaky fingers, she typed out a message to her father. "Dad, I need you at the court. Now." The seconds stretched into an eternity as she stood there, clutching her phone. Marilyn, emboldened by the lack of opposition, pulled out her own phone and began dialing. The sound of her voice, loud and self-assured, filled the air. "Yes, this is Marilyn Brown. I'm at the basketball court, and there's someone here who doesn't belong." Amara's breath hitched. She felt every pair of eyes on her, their silent judgment weighing heavy on her shoulders. Her vision blurred slightly, but she blinked away the tears threatening to fall. She wouldn't give Marilyn the satisfaction. And then, as if summoned by her desperation, the low hum of an approaching car cut through the oppressive silence. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its polished exterior gleaming under the sun. The car door opened, and out stepped a tall, commanding figure. Amara exhaled a shaky breath. Her father had arrived. The faint rumble of the car engine grew louder, cutting through the tense air that had engulfed the basketball court. Heads turned towards the sleek black sedan pulling up alongside the curb, its polished surface gleaming under the sun. Marilyn's words trailed off mid-sentence as the car door swung open. From within emerged a tall, impeccably dressed man, whose presence immediately commanded attention. Dariush Bennett, Amara's father and a prominent state senator, stepped out with a calm yet purposeful air. His tailored navy suit, crisply ironed shirt, and the faint glint of a pin on his lapel, signifying his position, made him an unmistakable figure. He closed the car door gently but firmly, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached the court. Amara, standing stiffly with her phone still in hand, felt a wave of relief wash over her at the sight of her father. Yet beneath her relief simmered the emotions she had tried so hard to suppress. Humiliation, anger, and a quiet but searing exhaustion. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to give Marilyn the satisfaction, but the tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. Marilyn, who had been radiating authority just moments earlier, now hesitated. Her confident stance wavered as she took in the man approaching. Her phone, still clutched in her hand, hovered uncertainly by her ear before she slowly lowered it. There was something in Dariush's steady gaze that made even the boldest confrontations feel unwarranted. "Amara," Dariush said, his voice calm yet resonant, "are you all right?" His daughter nodded silently, swallowing the lump in her throat. The tension in her body began to ease slightly, though she still felt the weight of every eye on her. She couldn't bring herself to speak. The moment felt too overwhelming. Dariush turned his attention to Marilyn, his expression composed but unyielding. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the weight of authority. "Excuse me," he began, his tone polite but firm. "Can you explain why my daughter is being harassed on a public basketball court?" The question hung in the air, slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. Marilyn straightened her posture, instinctively bristling at the perceived challenge. She cleared her throat, trying to regain some semblance of the control she had wielded moments ago. "Sir," she began, her voice faltering slightly, "I was merely trying to ensure that the rules of this community are respected. This court is maintained by the residents, and I didn't recognize—" "You didn't recognize her," Dariush interrupted, his voice measured but sharp. "And you assumed, based on that alone, that she didn't belong here." Marilyn's face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The onlookers, who had been hesitant to intervene, now seemed emboldened by the senator's presence. Whispered conversations rippled through the small crowd, their collective unease shifting toward quiet disapproval of Marilyn's actions. "I didn't mean any harm," Marilyn stammered finally. "I was just trying to make sure everything was in order." "In order," Dariush repeated, his tone now carrying an edge of incredulity. "By interrogating a 14-year-old girl, by threatening to call the police." Marilyn flinched slightly at the word police. The stark reality of her actions began to dawn on her, though she still clung to her justification. "I thought," she started, but Dariush didn't let her finish. "No," he said, his voice firm, "you didn't think. You acted on assumptions rooted in bias. And in doing so, you singled out my daughter in front of everyone here." Amara watched her father, her chest tightening with a mixture of gratitude and pride. He wasn't just defending her, he was standing up against the very kind of injustice she had always felt, but couldn't always articulate. His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of truth. Marilyn shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Dariush and the onlookers. For the first time, she seemed to realize the full scope of the scene she had created. The judgmental stares that had been directed at Amara were now focused squarely on her. The murmurs grew louder as more parents and teens gathered closer, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disapproval. One of the teenagers, a boy who had paused his game to watch, muttered to his friend, "She messed with the wrong family." Dariush turned slightly, addressing the crowd without losing focus on Marilyn. "This court is public property," he said, his voice carrying across the space. "It belongs to every member of this community, regardless of who they are or where they come from. My daughter has every right to be here, just like anyone else." His words hung in the air, resonating with a gravity that silenced even the faintest whispers. The parents who had remained seated now looked visibly uncomfortable, some shifting in their seats as if reconsidering their earlier inaction. A few nodded in quiet agreement. Marilyn, however, wasn't ready to back down entirely. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," she said defensively, though her voice lacked its previous conviction. I just thought—" "No," Dariush said again, this time with finality. "What you thought doesn't justify what you did. You owe my daughter an apology." The demand was straightforward, but its weight was undeniable. Marilyn hesitated, her pride battling with the realization that she had no ground to stand on. Finally, she turned to Amara, her expression strained. "I'm sorry," she said, the words stiff and mechanical. "I didn't mean to offend you." Amara met her gaze, but said nothing. She didn't need to. The apology, however hollow, was a small victory, one that felt both validating and bittersweet. Satisfied, Dariush gave a slight nod. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse us, my daughter has some practicing to do." With that, he placed a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder and guided her back toward the center of the court. The onlookers began to disperse, their conversations quieter but tinged with a new sense of awareness. Some of the teens resumed their game, though their movements were slower, as if they were still processing what had unfolded. Marilyn lingered for a moment before hurriedly gathering her things and leaving the court. Her retreat was marked by a palpable tension, her once confident demeanor reduced to quiet embarrassment. Amara dribbled the ball absently, her mind still reeling from the confrontation. Her father stood nearby, watching her with a calm but watchful gaze. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Amara nodded, though her voice was quiet when she replied, "Yeah, I'm okay." Dariush studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You handled yourself well out there. I know it wasn't easy." "It wasn't," Amara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but thank you for being here." Her father's expression softened, and he gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Always." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the incident lingering between them. But as Amara resumed her practice, the rhythmic sound of the basketball hitting the pavement began to fill the air once more. Slowly but surely, the court began to feel like hers again. The basketball court, once filled with tension and uncertainty, was slowly returning to its usual rhythm. The sound of bouncing basketballs and the faint murmur of conversations began to fill the space again, though the energy remained subdued. Amara, standing at the free throw line, focused on her movements, trying to reclaim the peace she had felt before Maraline's intrusion. Her father, Dariush Bennett, stood a few feet away, his watchful gaze following her every move. Dariush wasn't just there as her protector, he was her anchor, a steady presence in the storm that had just passed. Though his words had diffused the immediate conflict, he could still see the weight of the encounter lingering in his daughter's posture. The slight tension in her shoulders, the way she held the basketball just a little too tightly. As Amara lined up her shot, one of the parents who had been sitting on the bench earlier approached. It was a middle-aged man with a sheepish expression and a nervous gait. He cleared his throat softly, drawing both Amara's and Dariush's attention. "Senator Bennett," the man began, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I saw what was happening earlier, and I didn't step in. I should have. That wasn't right." Amara froze mid-motion, the ball hovering in her hands. She looked at the man, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Dariush gave the man a measured nod, his expression calm but thoughtful. "It takes courage to admit that," Dariush said evenly, "but what matters now is what you do moving forward." The man nodded quickly, his face flushing. "You're absolutely right. I promise. I'll speak up next time. No one should have to go through that." Amara's grip on the basketball relaxed slightly. Hearing the man's apology didn't erase the sting of what had happened, but it chipped away at the sense of isolation she had felt during the confrontation. For the first time, she glanced around the court, noticing the subtle shifts in the crowd's demeanor. Parents and teens alike seemed more subdued, their conversations quieter, their glances softer. Another parent, a woman holding the hand of a small child, stepped forward. "I feel the same," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I didn't know what to do, but staying silent wasn't the answer. I'm sorry, too." Amara looked to her father, her eyes silently asking for guidance. Dariush met her gaze with a small, reassuring smile before addressing the growing group. "Silence," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the court, "is often the easiest choice, but it's rarely the right one. When we see injustice, whether it's blatant or subtle, we have a responsibility to act, to say something, to do something." His words resonated deeply, drawing in more of the onlookers who had remained on the sidelines during the earlier confrontation. A few teenagers shuffled closer, their expressions earnest but uncertain. One of them, a boy around Amara's age, stepped forward hesitantly. I'm sorry too," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know what to say, but I saw what was happening, and it wasn't cool." Amara felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, relief, and a lingering trace of sadness. She hadn't expected anyone to apologize, let alone a group of strangers, but their words gave her a sense of validation that she hadn't realized she needed. Dariush nodded approvingly at the boy. Acknowledging it is the first step, but the real work is in taking action when it counts. The boy nodded, his cheeks reddening slightly as he stepped back into the crowd. Another murmur rippled through the group, the weight of Dariush's words settling over them. As the apologies and reflections continued, Amara noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The court no longer felt like a hostile environment. Instead, it felt like a space where change was possible, a place where people were beginning to understand the impact of their actions, or lack thereof. Then, unexpectedly, one of the teenagers from the pickup game jogged over, a basketball tucked under his arm. He stopped a few feet from Amara, his expression earnest. "Hey," he said, his voice a little awkward, "we're short a player. You want to join?" Amara blinked, caught off guard by the invitation. She glanced at her father, who gave her an encouraging nod before turning back to the boy. "Yeah," she said slowly, a small smile forming on her lips. "I'd like that." The boy grinned and gestured for her to follow him. As Amara stepped onto the court with the group of teens, she felt a renewed sense of belonging. They passed her the ball, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to relax. Dariush watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments like this. But seeing his daughter find her footing again, even in the aftermath of such a painful experience, filled him with hope. As the game unfolded, the murmurs from the parents on the bench grew into quiet conversations about change. One of the lifeguards from the nearby pool, who had watched the incident earlier but hadn't intervened, approached Dariush. The young man, barely out of his teens himself, looked visibly uneasy. "Sir," the lifeguard began, his voice low, "I want to apologize. I saw what happened, but I didn't do anything. I should have said something." Dariush regarded him thoughtfully. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said. "What matters is that you've learned from this." The lifeguard nodded, his expression serious. "I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. And I'll talk to the management about training. We need to handle situations like this better." Dariush gave him a firm handshake. "That's a start." The lifeguard walked away, his steps purposeful. Dariush turned his attention back to the game, where Amara was now fully immersed, her laughter mingling with the cheers and shouts of the other players. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the court, the energy of the space had transformed. What had started as a moment of confrontation had become a powerful lesson in accountability and change. The community, once divided by silence and hesitation, was now united in its commitment to do better. When the game finally ended, Amara walked off the court, her face flushed with exertion but glowing with satisfaction. She approached her father, who greeted her with a proud smile. "You played well," he said. "Thanks," she replied, her voice lighter than it had been all day. "And thanks for everything." Dariush placed a hand on her shoulder. "You handled yourself with grace, Amara. Never forget that your voice matters, even when others try to silence it." She nodded, the weight of his words settling in her chest like a quiet strength. Together, they walked toward their car, the court behind them now filled with the echoes of change. As they drove away, the basketball court stood as a symbol of resilience, a place where a community had been challenged to confront its biases and take the first steps toward a more inclusive future. For Amara, it was no longer just a court. It was a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there is power in standing tall and speaking out. Thank you for watching. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Share this with your friends to spark important conversations, and explore more stories on our channel for insight and inspiration. Let's spread the message together.